Hi, I am Kevin Scott, and today I am going to discuss the events that led up to and the outcome of the HealthSouth accounting scandal. HealthSouth was the nation's largest provider of outpatient surgery, outpatient diagnostic, and rehabilitative healthcare services. The company provided these services through a national network of inpatient and outpatient healthcare facilities, outpatient surgery centers, diagnostic centers, occupational medicine centers, medical centers, and other healthcare facilities. HealthSouth was the largest owner and operator of hospitals and was present in 36 states and served over 28% of the total Medicare inpatient rehabilitation patients. HealthSouth was founded on February 22, 1984 in Birmingham, Alabama by Richard Scrushy and Aaron Beam. HealthSouth started out offering outpatient medical care facilities, but quickly transitioned to owning and operating rehabilitation hospitals. The company opened its first facility in Little Rock, Arkansas, and one in Birmingham later that year. Success came fast, and in 1986, just 2 years after its launch, HealthSouth went public. By 1990, the company had expanded to 50 facilities across the U.S. HealthSouth finished out 1992 with $400 million in annual revenue. In 1993, the company made its first large acquisition when it bought 28 hospitals and 45 outpatient rehabilitation facilities from National Medical Enterprise for around $300 million in cash. The acquisition doubled the company's annual revenue to $1 billion and also made HealthSouth the nation's largest provider of rehabilitative care. By 1994, HealthSouth had grown to 40,000 employees and had become the largest company in Alabama. This milestone pushed HealthSouth onto the Fortune 500 list. In the summer of 1996, HealthSouth badly missed its earning target. Beam and Bill Owens, the company's chief accountant at the time, and later its CFO, conferred to tell Scrushy there was no choice but to report the shortfall. Beam's account is that Scrushy turned red and began to tremble. He screamed at the two finance executives and they'd lost their minds, that the company would absolutely not report bad numbers because the stock would crash and there would be lawsuits. Scrushy said, "You know how to fix these numbers. Now go back to your offices and do it." The HealthSouth executives devised a plan to meet Scrushy's expectations. The company would understate its accounts receivable reserves and overstate its revenues. In addition, the revenue recognition irregularities, misclassification of expenses was also utilized. During the height of the fraud, HealthSouth had $275 million of cash recorded on its balance sheet while actually possessing over closer to $25 million. Another big area of fraud was around mergers and acquisitions. In the acquisitions account, the company created every liability it could dream of and put them into the open entry under assumed debt. Then the net assets were understated, primarily through accounts receivable reserves. In 1998, the company spent $766 million to acquire $15 million worth of assets. Many of HealthSouth executive management group happened to be made up of former Ernst & Young auditors, which was the public assurance firm auditing HealthSouth, and thus were especially well positioned to keep the fraud from the public by deceiving the audit engagement team. For example, management knew that Ernst & Young's material threshold for examining fixed asset additions was $5,000. This meant that as long as HealthSouth employees only moved amounts of money less than $5,000 at a time, the fictitious transactions would not be picked up by E&Y's auditing procedures. However, this required a massive amount of work. With an average fictitious journal entry of $2,500 in order to overstate income by $2.7 billion, it would take over 1 million separate transactions. Not only did HealthSouth employees have to create each individual journal entry, false documentation and fixed asset ledgers were created to show auditors in order to further conceal the fraud. HealthSouth employees went above and beyond to conceal the fictitious entries from the auditors, which was what allowed the fraud to exist for so long. There were as many as 126,000 fraudulent journal entries in a single quarter. While the fraud was occurring at HealthSouth, there were multiple warnings from outside sources to auditors that would have tipped them off to the fraud's existence. Michael Vines was a bookkeeper at HealthSouth who oversaw the purchase of equipment. After his warnings to several members of management went unnoticed, Mr. Vines left his position at HealthSouth for another job. Upon leaving HealthSouth, Mr. Vines sent a letter to E&Y auditors which read, "I know that HealthSouth, based out of Birmingham, Alabama, has severe problems in its accounting department. In December 2001, HealthSouth moved expenses to capital accounts. The following accounts need to be looked at." Mr. Vines identified 3 specific accounts for auditors to look at to discover the fraud. However, instead of investigating the email on their own, E&Y called the CFO of HealthSouth, who claimed Mr. Vines was just a disgruntled employee and he was making his allegations up. The auditors believed this explanation and never looked into the accounts Mr. Vines identified. E&Y also received an email from a disgruntled shareholder expressing concern about fraud within HealthSouth. The email read, "I have a list of questions. What I hope might interest you. How can the HealthSouth outpatient clinics treat patients without pre-certification, book the revenue, and carry it after being denied payments? How can the company carry tens of millions of dollars in accounts receivable that are well over 360 days? How can some hospitals have no bad debt reserves? How did E&Y auditors in Alabama miss this stuff?" Despite multiple specific warnings about the fraud at HealthSouth, E&Y still failed to bring the fraud to light. In 2003, Weston Smith, a former CFO, tipped off federal investigators to the HealthSouth fraud. Soon after, many other employees who had participated in the fraud turned themselves in as well. On March 19, 2003, the Securities and Exchange Commission filed civil fraud charges against HealthSouth and Squishy for allegedly duping investors into believing the company had met earnings targets. Once the accounting scandal went public, HealthSouth's share price dropped from $3.91 to as low as 35 cents a share, costing shareholders millions. Lawsuits were filed by shareholders against HealthSouth, Squishy, and Ernst & Young. All five CFOs pleaded guilty to criminal charges, resulting in Beam and Smith serving 3 months and 27 months of jail time, respectively. All 5 CFOs testified that HealthSouth co-founder and CEO Richard Squishy was behind the fraud, but the defense hammered away at the CFO's credibilities during Squishy's 2005 trial, and Squishy was acquitted of all charges. Although found not guilty on criminal charges, Squishy paid $81 million to the SEC to settle civil charges related to the fraud, and in 2009 was ruled to owe almost $3 billion to shareholders in a class action lawsuit. E&Y also settled the shareholders' class action lawsuit for $109 million due to their gross negligence in the audit of HealthSouth. There were many factors that played into the HealthSouth accounting scandal. When Beam was asked what went wrong, he replied that he and Squishy were greedy. "It was so much fun being rich, buying those ties and flying all over the world in our private jets. Squishy was especially greedy, striving to be a billionaire and the richest man in Alabama." This concludes my analysis of the HealthSouth accounting fraud of 2003.